The cold, pale blue light of a late twilight reflects off the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of our sleek, high-rise urban apartment, casting a clinical geometric glow across the room. Outside, the vast, sprawling metropolis stretches into the horizon, an infinite grid of neon signs, creeping headlights and illuminated office blocks that hums with a distant collective electricity. Inside our sanctuary, the environment is perfectly controlled, perfectly silent, and perfectly clean. The only sound is the low, barely audible whisper of a computer fan or a data server cooling down on our minimalist metal desk. On the screen, a tiny green unread message notification blinks with a steady, mechanical rhythm, illuminating the surface of a single glass of ice water standing next to the keyboard. By all outward appearances, we have achieved the ultimate dream of modern urban success: absolute autonomy, total self-reliance, and an unassailable perimeter of personal safety. We are entirely independent, answerable to no one, and completely insulated from the erratic, unpredictable demands of the external world. Yet, if we tune our awareness into the immediate climate of our own flesh, we are met with a dry, suffocating constriction that feels like an iron band wrapping around the center of our lungs. We are sitting alone in our pristine tower, completely safe from injury, yet we are experiencing a slow, systemic freezing of our own vital currents. We look down at the bustling streets below through a layer of deep, cynical detachment, a habit of mind that we have carefully cultivated to serve as our primary defense mechanism against the chaos of human existence. We have turned our hyper-intellectual independence into a magnificent armor. We look down at the messy, volatile, and emotionally expensive theater of human relationships from our safe vertical height, congratulating ourselves on our wisdom, our maturity, and our boundary management. We tell ourselves that we have evolved past the primitive need for external validation, that we do not require the comfort of a tribe, and that we are fully capable of processing our own pain, generating our own security, and maintaining our own psychological equilibrium. We see the dramatic downfalls of those who love too deeply, the public humiliations of those who allow themselves to be vulnerable, and the systemic betrayals that occur when human beings foolishly place their trust in one another. Guided by this sharp, analytical cynicism, we have systematically severed our emotional dependency lines, withdrawing our heart into a sterile, uncompromised cube where no one can ever disappoint us, no one can ever mislead us, and no one can ever catch us off guard. But if we look directly into the living mechanics of this immediate second, we can see the terrifying, self-inflicted isolation of this strategy. In our desperate pursuit of an absolute, invulnerable safety, we have transformed our fortress of autonomy into a solitary confinement cell. We have confused being uninjured with being alive. We sit behind our double-glazed glass, completely protected from the friction of human connection, completely immune to the sting of rejection, yet we are dying of absolute emotional starvation. We have structured our lives so that we never have to ask for help, never have to admit a weakness, and never have to depend on the flawed, imperfect reliability of another human being. We operate our relationships like transactional business contracts, calculating the risk of every conversation, analyzing the hidden motives of every gesture, and maintaining a cold, intellectual distance that ensures our true center is never touched, never altered, and never stained by the contact of another presence. We are entirely safe. Yes, we have outsmarted the messy design of human interdependence, but we stand in the center of our immaculate room, surrounded by our accomplishments, struck by a bone-deep coldness, born from the realization that by making ourselves completely invulnerable, we have also made ourselves completely dead. This is the hidden tragedy of the modern hyper-independent mind, an existential bankruptcy that we hide beneath the labels of self-sufficiency and high-functioning autonomy. We are so busy scanning our digital perimeters, so occupied with calculating our emotional exposure that we do not notice that our world has shrunk into a tiny, claustrophobic tomb of our own making. We are like a general who has successfully defended his city by ordering every citizen to enter an underground bunker and seal the doors, completely blind to the fact that while the enemy can no longer launch a successful strike, the city itself is suffocating in its own darkness. We return to our clean, silent apartments at the end of every day, look out at the beautiful, indifferent city lights, and feel an immense hollow ache in the back of our throat, a thirst that cannot be quenched by ice water or intellectual achievements, because it is the cry of a biological organism that is being starved of its natural, evolutionary atmosphere. We have built an unyielding wall against the messiness of connection, completely oblivious to the fact that the very wall we constructed to preserve our life has become the monument that isolates us from the deep living currents of the human sea. We are like a highly skilled, technologically sophisticated deep-sea diver who has descended into the heavy black waters of a profound ocean channel to explore the seabed. The water pressure around the diver is immense, a crushing physical weight that demands absolute structural integrity, and far above them, swaying gently in the dark current, runs a thick, copper umbilical tube that connects their heavy metal suit to the surface vessel. Through this tube, the crew on deck is continuously pumping a steady, rhythmic stream of fresh, living air down into the helmet, keeping the diver alive in the center of the abyss. But as the diver looks up through their thick glass visor at the long tube twisting through the water, they are suddenly seized by a profound, paralyzing wave of cynicism and mistrust. They think to themselves, those people on the boat are flawed, unreliable, and unpredictable. What if the crew falls asleep at the wheel? What if the captain mismanages the pump? What if they decide to cut my line because they grow tired of supporting my weight? My survival is currently entirely dependent on the imperfect, volatile nature of strangers, and this is an intolerable risk to my safety. Driven by this absolute terror of dependency, the diver decides to take total control of their existence. They pull a sharp, heavy steel knife from their utility belt, reach up through the water, and with a single white-knuckle stroke, they slash the copper umbilical tube in half. A massive burst of silver air bubbles rushes into the dark ocean as the severed line floats away toward the surface, completely disconnected from the boat. The diver stands alone on the dark, silent seabed, looking down at their empty hands, filled with a sudden triumphant sense of absolute independence. They think to himself, I am finally free. I do not need the crew. I do not owe anyone my breath, and I am completely autonomous in the center of the deep. But within a few short minutes, the air inside their heavy metal helmet begins to turn warm, heavy, and toxic. The very tube they cut to ensure their safety was their only actual link to the wild, living atmosphere of the world above. They have achieved absolute self-reliance. Yes, they are completely free from the errors of the crew. But they are standing inside a pristine, uncompromised tomb of their own making, suffocating to death on the breath they have already exhaled. This is the kinetic tragedy of our hyper-independent lives. We are cutting our own oxygen lines to avoid relying on an imperfect world, freezing our vital organs in a state of self-enforced isolation, completely blind to the fact that the very connection we are destroying to guarantee our survival is the only thing that connects us to the living breath of the universe. To dissect this self-imposed suffocation with absolute clinical sharpness, let us look directly into the life of an archetype that populates every high-end corporate district, every minimalist design agency, and every solitary apartment in our digital world. Let us study the mechanics of the one we might call the autonomous modern hermit. This is not a person who appears broken, disorganized, or visibly fragile. On the contrary, they are often exceptionally competent, highly disciplined, and fiercely intelligent. They are the ones who pride themselves on never needing a favor, never missing a deadline due to emotional distraction, and never letting anyone see them lose their absolute polished control. They are celebrated as pillars of self-reliance, masters of emotional maturity, and models of hyper-focused professional autonomy. But beneath this seamless, efficient exterior lies a profound, unexamined survival panic. For the modern hermit, hyper-independence is not a healthy lifestyle choice. It is a full-time, involuntary defense mechanism built to survive a history of profound interpersonal disappointment. At some critical point in their development, they learned a brutal, definitive lesson. To need another human being is to invite humiliation, abandonment, or control. They discovered that the people who were supposed to pump air into their world were distracted, unstable, or fundamentally unreliable. Driven by this trauma, their intellect arrived at a permanent, unyielding survival decree. I will build an island where I am the king, the priest, and the soldier. I will become so rich, so smart, and so emotionally self-contained that I will never again have to place my heart in the hands of an imperfect stranger. When they enter the social or professional marketplace, the hermit does not engage in a fluid reciprocal exchange of life force. Instead, their mind treats every interaction as a sophisticated risk assessment. If someone offers them an unearned kindness, their internal alarm system instantly flashes code red, scanning the gesture for hidden transactions or future obligations. If a relationship begins to drift toward genuine intimacy, where their vulnerabilities might be exposed, they immediately deploy their intellectual armor. They use cynicism, hypercriticism, or a sudden obsession with their career boundaries to freeze the connection, pushing the other person back to a safe, manageable distance. They tell themselves that this cold detachment is a sign of high emotional intelligence, but it is actually a profound act of terror and absolute refusal to step into the unpredictable, volatile currents of a shared human existence. While the intellect is busy celebrating its absolute, uncompromised autonomy behind the glass windows of its high-rise tower, the physical body is paying a devastating daily tax for this total self-containment. The biological organism does not understand the abstract pride of self-reliance. It only registers whether it is part of a living ecosystem or isolated in a frozen vacuum. When we cut our emotional dependency lines to protect our ego from injury, our physical tissues record this isolation as a chronic state of emergency. Let us perform a precise, clinical dissection of this hyper-independent armor as it carves its rigid geometry into our living tissue, tracing its map from the ear canals down into the deepest muscles of our respiratory rim. Observe first the ear canals and the delicate, complex muscular networks of the temporal bones, specifically the tensor, tympani and stapedius muscles. For the modern hermit, this acoustic gateway is held in a state of permanent defensive contraction, because they operate under the chronic subconscious assumption that the environment is hostile and unpredictable. Their ears are physically braced against the local atmosphere. They are not listening to receive the world, they are listening to scan for threats and data. This constant tension creates a literal, somatic dullness in their hearing, a physical tuning out of the ambient, raw frequencies of everyday life. They can hear the digital alert of an email with crystal clarity, but they can no longer register the subtle, warm nuances of a human voice, the laughter of a child in the hallway, or the gentle rustle of leaves outside. Their ears have become closed gates, sealing them inside an acoustic tomb where the only voice they can fully hear is the endless, cynical monologue of their own thoughts. From the head, this current of defensive isolation drops straight into the shoulder girdle and the massive fibers of the upper trapezius. Watch the autonomous hermit as they sit at their minimalist metal desk, or walk through a crowded urban transit station. Their shoulders are not dropped into their natural, heavy sockets, they are pulled subtly upward and forward, forming a permanent, muscular, defensive wall around the sides of the neck and the base of the skull. This is the physical architecture of the unyielding fortress. The body is unconsciously bracing itself against an unwanted intrusion, a sudden demand for vulnerability, or an unexpected emotional strike from the environment. This chronic elevation starves the cervical spine of blood and oxygen, creating a hard, iron-like consolidation in the upper back that makes a loose, panoramic movement of the head completely impossible. They cannot look around with a soft, trusting gaze. They can only scan the horizon through a narrow, rigid field of view, locked inside their own defensive posture. This calcified armor reaches its ultimate perfection in the intercostal spaces between the ribs and the deep horizontal rim of the diaphragm. For the hyper-independent individual, the mid-torso is held like a tight steel barrel. They do not allow their ribcage to expand wide, loose, and horizontally into the room when they inhale. To do so would mean allowing the outside atmosphere to push against their chest, altering their internal pressure, and making them vulnerable to the impact of the local environment. Therefore, they restrict their breathing to a flat, hard vertical movement, keeping their internal pressure high, isolated, and completely self-contained. They breathe with an analytical caution, as if deeply inhaling the atmosphere of a shared world might accidentally introduce a contaminant that would soften their edges or compromise their control. Their lungs are working inside a straitjacket of their own making, converting every breath into an act of white-knuckle resistance against the very air that keeps them alive. What is the underlying psychological error that sentences us to this state of living death? Why do we trade the warm, vibrant messiness of human interdependence for the cold safety of our solitary towers? The answer lies in the deep, addictive illusion of absolute self-containment. The ego of the hermit believes that it can bypass the foundational design of cosmic physics. It tells itself that it is a separate capsule that can exist apart from the web of conditions, observing reality from behind a glass screen without ever needing to rely on the imperfect hands of others. It does not see that by cutting its umbilical line to avoid the risk of a faulty pump, it has guaranteed its own slow suffocation. We are hollowing out our own vitality, turning our muscles to iron and our lungs to stone for the sake of an invulnerable perimeter, completely blind to the fact that the absolute autonomy we are guarding so fiercely is not freedom at all, but the silence of a graveyard where no one can touch us because we have already buried ourselves alive. To crack open this clinical prison of self-containment, to drop the iron shoulders and unlock the stiff steel barrel of the ribcage, we must bring a sharp, surgical awareness into the silent control room of our isolation. We must confront our sophisticated intellectual autonomy with the unblinking clarity of the ancient physician who looked at the human mind not as a closed, independent capsule that can survive in a vacuum, but as an open, dynamic stream that becomes toxic the moment it attempts to isolate itself from the great river of life. His insight slices directly through our modern illusions of hyper-regulated self-reliance, exposing the core mechanical error that turns our psychological perimeters into a suffocating tomb. He observed that all our cynical armor, all our risk assessments, and all our emotional self-sufficiency rest entirely upon a single, unexamined illusion: the fiction of the isolated vessel. The human ego possesses a deep, frantic craving to build an absolute capsular, solid, independent fortress that can stand completely apart from the messy, volatile, and unpredictable currents of the changing world, observing reality from a safe distance, without ever needing to rely on the imperfect hands of others. We treat our identity as if it were a self-contained submarine that must keep its hatches bolted tight to avoid being contaminated by the dark waters of the sea. But if we slow down our analytical commentary and look directly into the living physics of this immediate second, we discover a truth that is far more radical, far more porous, and completely liberating. The self is not an isolated capsule, it is an open exchange station. There is no solid, independent wall dividing your internal life from the external universe. The very air that is entering your lungs right now was moving through the lungs of a stranger outside. A moment ago, the atoms that make up your flesh are constantly cycling through the soil, the rain, and the breath of other living mammals. Your consciousness is not an isolated computer calculating data from behind a glass screen. It is a highly sensitive, transparent membrane that exists entirely in a state of continuous, unforced resonance with everything it encounters. When we try to insulate ourselves from the vulnerability of dependence, we are performing an act of supreme biological absurdity. We are like a single wave in the ocean trying to build a concrete wall around itself to keep from being touched by the rest of the water. The very wall we construct to preserve our safety becomes the mechanism that isolates us from the deep, living currents of the sea, leaving us stagnant, cold, and completely cut off from our own foundational source of life. To lay bare the immense self-inflicted violence of this strategy, the ancient teacher offered his diagnostic framework of the two arrows. Applying it directly to our habits of bitter withdrawal, he explained that as long as we move through an unpredictable world, inhabited by other unawakened minds, we will inevitably encounter the raw, sharp impact of human imperfection. This is the first arrow. It is the sudden, unexpected disappointment of a partner, failing to understand our depth. It is the clean, honest sorrow of a relationship coming to its natural end. It is the raw shock of a friend acting out of their own unhealed conditioning. These events are sharp, and they are designed to hurt. They strike the open tissue of our presence, creating a sudden flash of heat in the chest, a contraction in the throat, or a rush of tears. This is the first arrow of human connection, the objective, unconditioned friction of a world made of impermanence and interaction. But for the hyper-independent strategist, the first arrow of interpersonal disappointment is an intolerable humiliation. The moment the sharp tip of someone else's unreliability makes contact with their skin, their mind panics and instantly mobilizes the second arrow of bitter withdrawal. Instead of allowing the clean, sharp sting of the wound to be felt, to be wept over, and to naturally wash through the system, the intellect immediately deploys its heavy padding of cynicism, intellectual superiority, and emotional anesthesia. It launches into a frantic internal decree, declaring that nobody can be trusted, cutting the oxygen lines to the surface vessel, and wrapping the heart in an unyielding wall of self-sufficiency, so that the direct impact of human messiness can never touch them again. This is the second arrow of our insulation, the voluntary, systematic poisoning of our own capacity for connection. The first arrow causes a wound that can heal. The second arrow creates a permanent, calcified state of living death that destroys our ability to breathe. The terrifying revelation that we must all confront in the absolute stillness of this room is that our emptiness is not caused by the cruelty of the world. It is caused by our refusal to let the world touch us. By using our cynicism to blunt the edge of every disappointment, we have also blunted the edge of every joy. We have used the second arrow to perform a slow daily lobotomy on our own emotional body, transforming ourselves into walking ghosts who can discuss the theory of freedom with immense eloquence, but who can no longer feel a single degree of human warmth. Let us look back at the image of the deep-sea diver, standing alone on the dark, silent seabed in the cold light of the abyss, and examine the true nature of his triumph. He believes that by slashing his copper umbilical tube, he has achieved absolute freedom and protected himself from the potential mistakes of the surface crew. But look at his helmet. The glass is fogging over with his own warm, carbon-choked breath. His lungs are burning with a profound, unnatural fatigue, and his chest is heaving with shallow, frustrated gasps. Why? 'Cause it requires 10 times more physical energy to survive inside a closed metal capsule than it does to let the wild living atmosphere flow naturally through an open line. He has successfully insulated himself from the errors of the crew, yet his own vital force is turning to ice beneath the heavy metal suit. This is the exact kinetic cost of our hyper-independent modern existence. We believe that our emotional boundaries and analytical detachment are saving us energy, but the reality is that maintaining this fortress is the most exhausting project we have ever undertaken. It requires an immense, continuous expenditure of vital biological force to keep the world at bay. The mind must remain on high alert 24 hours a day, constantly scanning every message, every gesture, and every offer of kindness, ready to deploy the defensive armor before the raw impact of intimacy can hit the center of the chest. We are wearing ourselves out, suffocating inside a pristine metal helmet, completely blind to the fact that the very line we cut to ensure our safety is the only thing that could have connected us to the wild, living atmosphere of the world. Our lives are not changing shape. Our relationships are not growing deeper, and our inner world is freezing over, not because the universe is inherently hostile, but because we have insulated ourselves so perfectly that the breath of life can no longer reach our bones. The recognition that our hyper-independent fortress has become a solitary confinement cell, that the sharp knife we use to slash our connection lines is the very tool suffocating our inner organism, marks the true beginning of our return to the living world. It is a profoundly unsettling and deeply humbling threshold, for it strips away the pride we have taken in our high-functioning autonomy, revealing our self-sufficiency not as a sign of advanced evolution, but as a calcified fear of vulnerability. Yet, within this structural breakdown lies a magnificent, uncompromised opportunity for reclamation. If we are the ones who have systematically severed our own umbilical tubes, to avoid the risk of relying on an imperfect world, then we are the ones who possess the absolute somatic authority to open the valves and breathe again. This is not a theoretical realization to be filed away in another conceptual cabinet. It is a direct, kinetic sequence of actions that we must execute within the immediate laboratory of our own nervous system, sitting in this very room as the night deepens around us. The first fundamental movement in this architecture of radical unburdening requires us to deliberately unlock the audio gate and retune our senses. When we live as autonomous hermits, our mind operates behind a thick sheet of psychological double-glazing, filtering out the ambient, raw frequencies of local human life to maintain an illusion of absolute control. The moment we step into a space, whether it is a shared office, a public transit car, or our own domestic quarter-saw, habitual reflex is to tighten the delicate muscles surrounding the ear canals and temporal bones, turning the surrounding environment into a dull, flat background noise while we remain locked inside the cynical monologue of our own thoughts. To train the mind in true presence, we must learn to drop this defensive acoustic filtering and allow the raw vibrations of the local world to strike the eardrum without intellectual mediation. Let us practice this direct sensory exposure right now. Bring your awareness away from the analytical cortex and drop it down into the physical structures surrounding your ears. Feel the subtle, chronic grip in the temporal bones, the tightness in the jaw hinges, and the elevation in the upper trapezius muscles that form a permanent defensive wall around the base of your skull. Strip away the narrative of why isolation is safer. Delete the cynical risk assessments of your history, and look at what is happening inside your flesh in this immediate heartbeat. Is there a dense, iron-like consolidation wrapping the back of your neck? Is there a flat, hard restriction in the intercostal spaces between your ribs, holding your chest like a tight steel barrel? Is there a shallow, vertical caution in your breathing that refuses to expand horizontally into the room? As you observe these physical coordinates with uninterrupted focus, your mind will experience a powerful, terrified urge to run back up into the head to resume its calculations. The ego panics when it is forced to drop its armor and listen to a world it cannot control. This is where the discipline of the open lung must be applied. You must practice the art of welcoming the ambient frequency without initiating a defensive contraction. If you hear a sudden noise from the street, the sound of a neighbor's footsteps, or the overlapping chatter of human voices, do not try to analyze it, judge it, or tune it out. Instead, consciously soften the muscular periphery around the temporal bones. Let your jaw unhinge completely, letting your mouth part slightly, breaking that habit of tight, overregulated moderation. Drop your shoulders back and down into their natural, heavy sockets, dismantling the iron fortress around your neck. By expanding the physical space around your sensory gates, you are telling your biology that you are vast enough to bear the raw friction of human life without needing to hide behind a copper capsule. You are allowing the environment to push against your eardrums and your skin, resting in the deep confidence that your presence is an open, breathing exchange station, not a fragile vessel that will shatter at the first true contact. This structural softening leads us directly into the second movement of our practice, the meditation on the porous membrane, which requires us to completely dismantle the illusion of the independent self. As we stay with the raw physical sensations of our isolation, keeping the surrounding tissues loose and wide, a remarkable mechanical truth begins to reveal itself to our consciousness. We discover that our boundaries are not solid, permanent concrete walls embedded in our anatomy. They are nothing but an energetic habit, a series of high-frequency micro-bracing actions that we must actively maintain from second to second to keep the world at bay. If we stop feeding these contractions with our thoughts, they reveal their true, porous nature. Watch the tight steel barrel of your ribcage with microscopic focus. Let your exhalation empty completely, dropping down into the very bottom of the breath, to that quiet, hollow room where there is no obligation to perform, no script to edit, and no perimeter to guard. And as the next inhalation arises naturally from the dark soil of the belly, do not draw it upward with analytical caution. Instead, let the breath expand horizontally, pushing outward into the sides of your ribs, widening the circumference of your chest into the room. Realize that the air entering your lungs right now is part of a shared global cycle. It is the wild atmosphere that has been exhaled by the trees, by the oceans, and by the very human beings you are trying so frantically to avoid. You cannot live a single minute without breathing the world. The illusion of your absolute self-containment evaporates in the face of this simple biological fact. You are not a separate submarine, you are a single porous link in a vast interconnected web of life. The sorrow and the joy of the collective environment are not threats to your survival, they are the very oxygen your soul needs to breathe, to keep its current from turning to ice. This brings us to the third and most radical step in our mental architecture, the deliberate practice of intentional reliance. This is the moment where we transition from passive observation to the active, courageous cultivation of naked connection in our daily lives. To open the valve and breathe the shared atmosphere means to deliberately strip away the cynical, hyper-independent persona that we present to our colleagues, our friends, and our communities. It means choosing the immense, terrifying dignity of letting ourselves need others, allowing our vulnerabilities to be witnessed, and accepting our place as a dependent strand in the living fabric of existence. You execute this surrender through the deliberate liberation of your relational and respiratory mechanics. The next time you find yourself entering an interaction that triggers your habitual defensive isolation, the next time someone offers you an unearned kindness, or the next time your body feels the heavy burden of a problem you are trying to solve entirely alone. Consciously interrupt the pattern. Before you speak, drop your breath deep past the throat, past the iron shoulders, forcing the air down into the soft lower abdomen, letting the belly round and expand completely. Abandon the hard abdominal shield that you have held to demonstrate absolute self-sufficiency. And as you engage with the person in front of you, open your throat wide, allowing your voice to drop into its natural, unmoderated resonance. Take the radical, unshielded risk of asking for a small favor, admitting a temporary weakness, or simply accepting a gesture of support without scanning it for future obligations. Strip away the intellectual justifications, drop the prefatory explanations, and allow your naked presence to depend directly on the local environment. You are choosing to be impacted by the world. You are choosing the glorious, ringing friction of shared reliance over the sterile safety of your solitary tower. This practice must be repeated not as a temporary therapeutic exercise, but as a permanent, breath-by-breath orientation of the nervous system. Every morning when you wake up and the mind instinctively reaches for its protective vest of cynical detachment, you must gently, firmly guide it back to the wide chest, the soft ears, and the heavy shoulders. Every time you find yourself rewriting an honest human dependency into a cold transactional calculation, you must fiercely halt the script, drop back into the raw heat of your torso, and choose the vulnerability of the open lung. This is the true meaning of internal discipline. It is a slow, methodical stripping away of the insulation that has kept your life frozen in absolute safety. You are training your mind to realize that your ultimate power does not lie in your ability to remain unimpacted by human messiness, but in your absolute willingness to let your heart be woven completely into the beautiful, chaotic, and magnificent web of existence that is standing directly in front of your face right now. As the final remnants of our hyper-independent armor dissolve into the wide, unrestricted movement of our breathing, a new and profoundly warm landscape of consciousness begins to reclaim the territory of our physical being. It is an awakening that does not feel like the clinical, double-glazed safety of an isolation booth, but rather like the sudden, brilliant opening of a heavy iron vault, exposing the frozen mechanism inside to the raw, moving currents of the wild world. Look closely at the immediate somatic miracle that occurs when we choose to drop the autonomous script and open the acoustic gates of our body. The delicate muscles surrounding the ear canals and the temporal bones, which have been held in a state of high-frequency defensive contraction for years, suddenly let go of their grip. The acoustic pathway widens, and for the first time in our adult life, the raw, ambient frequencies of local human existence strike the eardrum with absolute, unvarnished sharpness. We can hear the world again, not as a threat data stream to be scanned, but as a living symphony of shared presence. The structural release cascades down our central axis, dismantling the invisible blockades that have kept our vital core frozen in absolute self-containment. The iron-like elevation in the upper trapezius muscles relaxes, letting our shoulders drop back and down into their natural, heavy sockets, instantly clearing the fortress wall around the base of our skull. The tight steel barrel of the ribcage softens, allowing the intercostal spaces to expand horizontally into the room when we inhale. The breath is no longer a restricted vertical column controlled by analytical caution. It is a wide, generous wave that drops straight through the mid-torso, pushing open the lower gates of the pelvic bowl and anchoring our weight directly into the heels. We are no longer floating like disconnected ghosts inside a copper capsule on the ocean floor. We have opened the valves, reconnected our lines to the surface, and allowed ourselves to breathe the wild, shared atmosphere of the universe. In this uninsulated state of existence, we discover a profound, uncontrived dignity that has no need for fortresses, cynical risk assessments, or the pride of absolute self-sufficiency. We walk through the crowded marketplaces and the neon grids of our modern cities with an absolute unshielded skin, yet we are completely indestructible. We realize that our ultimate resilience does not lie in our ability to cut our dependency lines and live in a vacuum, but in our absolutely willingness to let our heart be woven into the beautiful, volatile, and unpredictable web of human connection. When the natural friction of human imperfection strikes our presence, when we encounter the sudden disappointment of a broken promise or the honest sorrow of a relationship changing its shape, these impacts do not crash against a rigid wall and shatter our sanity. Instead, they pass cleanly through our porous membrane like a wind howling through the crevices of an open rock, leaving us completely whole, completely alive, and completely awake. We have left the solitary high-rise tower, thrown away the knife of bitter withdrawal, and dropped naked into the great shared river of interdependent life. This was the final, devastating transmission offered by the great physician as he prepared to lay down his tools beneath the shade of the twin trees at the journey's end. He did not instruct his followers to build an unyielding island of autonomy to outsmart the messy design of existence. Nor did he promise that a life of awareness would insulate them from the natural sorrows of human interaction. He simply pointed to the total illusion of our separation, showing us that when we try to maintain a closed system, our mind becomes a stagnant, toxic pool that starves itself of the atmosphere of life. He revealed that the hyper-independence we are so frantically guarding through our cynicism is nothing but a slow, daily suicide and artificial tomb where we freeze our vitality to avoid the vulnerability of needing others. The world is not an environmental hazard to be managed from behind a glass screen. It is a magnificent, living organism that is begging to be exhaled and inhaled through the open window of our shared presence. The computer fan on our minimalist metal desk continues its quiet, automated whisper, and outside our window, the neon towers of the metropolis continue to stream their infinite data sheets of isolation and self-reliance. But inside the sanctuary of our own flesh, the armor has been thrown into the fire. The sharp knife of bitter withdrawal has been dropped into the sea. The binding cords have been cut, and the chest center is standing wide open, catching the deep stillness of the midnight hour on its porous surface. We sit in the absolute abundance of this shared reality, our shoulders heavy, our bellies soft, our breath expanding horizontally into the room, ready to receive whatever friction or whatever warmth the universe delivers next, without a single layer of filtration. If the copper umbilical tube you have slashed to ensure your absolute safety from the errors of the crew is the exact line that connects your lungs to the wild, living atmosphere of the world, who is the entity that is standing alone on the dark seabed tonight, frantically celebrating your independence while the air inside your helmet turns to suffocating ice? And if you were to completely drop the armor of your cynicism in this immediate second, allowing yourself to step forward into the messy, volatile marketplace of human relationships, with an unshielded chest, what would remain of the autonomous hermit you have spent your entire life trying to protect?